You are listening to the Speech Space Podcast, a podcast full of tips and resources for SLPs. I'm your host, Jessica Cassidy, and this is episode 47. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to be talking about a blog post that was written by Andee Szwabowski. And before I get started, I did want to take a brief moment to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by the Digital SLP membership site, which is a site that features time-saving, no-print, and low-prep resources for SLPs. The doors to the membership, unfortunately, just closed up on January the 31st of this year, which is 2019. But if you'd like to gain back some time, use less waste, and acquire some great resources, please head on over to thespeechspace.com/digital SLP to be notified when the doors reopen. You can also sign up for text alerts to be notified when the doors open back up by texting DSLP WAIT to 555-888. Again, that's DSLP WAIT to 555-888. Okay, so before I bring Andee on the show, I did want to tell you a little bit about her. She is the creator and author behind the digital materials over at the Whimsical Word on Teachers Pay Teachers. She's worked for more than 20 years as a public school SLP and jumped into the speech teletherapy world in 2016. Her response to lack of interactive digital materials for the virtual space was to create them herself. This quickly led to the birth of her TPT store, blog, and podcast. Andee has made it her mission to demystify speech telepractice for all SLPs. Currently, Andee serves as one of the new clinical therapy managers at .com Therapy, where she uses her experience as a school-based therapist to ensure excellence in service provision. So let's go ahead and bring Andee on the show. Hey, Andee, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so happy that we finally were able to make this work. I know we've been I think Andee and I have been going back and forth since, was it the fall, I think?
July.
Oh my goodness. Last summer? Yeah. So I'm so happy that we finally made this work. Today we're going to be talking about a blog post that Andee wrote that was all about SLPs leaving the school. I believe it was called Why SLPs Are Leaving the School. Is that right?
Yes, it was actually titled Dear Administrator, Why SLPs Are Leaving the Schools.
Okay. And what inspired you to write that post?
Well, a lot of things. I have spent just about 20 years as a public school SLP. And I've had varying experiences through that. I've worked for several different districts. I've worked with all kinds of students, ranges of students. And, as I went through my career, there were times where I simply felt, overworked, overburdened, wondering exactly what it was about the setting, the longer I stayed in it, why it was becoming more difficult, why I was having less resources, why my caseload was always super high, why it was difficult to get kids qualified or get what they needed. And then, I felt like the longer I stayed in public education, almost kind of like the worse things got. And, you think about that with age. I thought, well, maybe it's just my age and maybe I've just done this too long. And so now, these things are just, I'm learning more, and so I'm internalizing it more. So I had a chance in 2016 to jump into telepractice. And as a result of that, I was amazed at the difference in how I was feeling about my job. I was like, I can service kids one-on-one, and they're making progress. And I dictate what materials I use, and I dictate when we have the meetings. And I get to be the one who kind of calls the shots and kind of run this the way I think the kids deserve to have the service. And so in the process of that, I kind of started to blog about my experience. And as soon as I started to blog, I had this giant influx of people who were contacting me on social media, and they were saying, oh my gosh, I want to learn more about telepractice. Can you tell me more? And so in the beginning, and I can't do this now, but in the beginning, I actually would offer to either call people on the phone to tell them a little bit about telepractice. And I'll tell you my rationale for that. Reason being, I felt like at some point, if somebody would have said to me 15 years ago or 10 years ago that this was an option for me, I absolutely would have done it. Being a new mom, I really thought my options were schools, hospitals, early intervention, skilled nursing facility. Like I didn't know there were any other options. So I guess that was really my rationale for reaching out to people and being like, I don't know, I'd been a speech therapist for 20 years. I didn't even know that, how new is this? I didn't even realize it was an option. So that was my rationale for talking to people. But what happened in the process was I collected more and more and more stories of people who were either just like me, or what was even more alarming to me were people who were only 5 years out of the field who were calling me in tears. I had girls in tears. I can't even tell you the amount of long emails that I received from girls who were like, I can't take this. I'm having panic attacks at work. I have someone that maybe is, an administrator that's not nice to me. My caseload is 120 students. Can I jump into telepractice? And each story that I heard was almost validating to myself. And some of the stories actually kept me up at night. And I put that in the blog post. And so these were things that, ideas that have been swirling around my head for many, many years. And I've got this confirmation from all of these people. And I'm like, I just have to sit down and write this. I don't know what's going to happen as a result, but I'm just going to write it. So the post exactly is simply, I wrote the letter as if I was a speech therapist, kind of writing a resignation letter. And all of the things that I wish I had the courage at that time to almost tell an administrator about how I'm feeling based on the collection of stories that I received and my own feelings. And what happened as a result of that was this viral sort of an experience. And really, it was only one of my first, I think, 5 blog posts that I wrote that I did not anticipate. And I really, at some point, was kind of virtually covering my eyes thinking, people are really going to be angry about this. And I'm just going to have to take the hit. But to be honest with you, the result has been maybe 2% negative and 98% positive. And I continue to get responses on that post about, you put exactly what I was feeling into words, and thank you for validating me. And at the end of the letter, I actually say, to an administrator, while I appreciate this opportunity, I'm going off to kind of find a new adventure. And I don't know what that adventure necessarily is. For me, it was telepractice. But people are saying the post inspired me to actually think creatively outside of the box about where else I can take my career. And so in a way, that's a positive thing, because people are starting to think, well, I guess I really don't have to take this if I'm not happy. And really that really is the message. So that's what kind of inspired me. It's kind of led down a rabbit hole of other feelings for people, but that's really what inspired me to write it.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't realize that it was kind of like a collection of stories behind it. I think that's amazing that you kind of gave voices to all of those SLPs that you talked to over the years.
Yeah, it really was. And, throughout my career, I had been in these giant cohorts. I've always been lucky that I never was alone on an island. Except for maybe when I did early intervention, I always was lucky enough to work with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 speech therapists. And one of the last places I was at in a brick and mortar setting, we got together often and tried to discuss, how can we get together to kind of, inspire some waves of change? And how can we help meet the kids' needs? And how can we get our resources? Like, what extra things can we do? And no matter what idea we came up with, it was always met with resistance. It was be a warm body, service the students, take the $5 we give you and try to magically turn it into 25 to meet your students' needs, and don't ask questions. And it was even though we were collectively groups of people who really wanted to inspire change, nobody would listen. And I think that was really the disheartening part about it. And then, we watched some of our colleagues who I do mention in the post, And I don't mean to, offend any psychologist or social worker, but my experience has always been the psychologist gets the new office with the shiny test protocols, and I'm still, working with a PPVT2, and I don't, that's been outdated and no one will buy me a new test. And as I'm talking to people, these are the same experiences, and then the social worker's like, oh, wow, now I have 40 students. Oh, we're going to get you an intern to help you out. I'm like, 40 students? I've got 65. These poor girls in Indiana have 120, and I'm thinking this is everyone's experience, that somehow there are other disciplines that are very related to us that seem to almost, I don't know if it's all the time, but instead of it being more of a collaborative and we're all kind of on the same level, the administrators are putting them and their needs sort of before ours. Not that, every psych and every social worker I've ever worked with has been absolutely collaborative and wonderful. It was really more from a top-down perspective that they needed, so they got. And we were just a squeaky wheel. We were just a squeaky wheel complaining. So again, it was really a collection of stories from people that just resonated with my own. And what struck me again is that it wasn't just people in my age bracket who, let's be honest, there are some people that are bitter or they've had really bad experiences. And it was really girls that were 2 years out of school, 3 years out of school. It really didn't matter, to be honest with you, what their age was or how long they had spent in a school-based setting. Age really had very little to do with it.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny that you brought up the psychologist piece, because the article, and I'll make sure I link to this in the show notes, is so well written. But I actually had copied, and so I could quote you. It says, the psychologist who only visits the building twice a week on odd days gets a window. And I was like, wow, a lot of that will resonate with a lot of people for sure.
Right. I begged for a window. I literally, every job I ever got, I was like, can I just please have a window? I have seasonal affective disorder. So for me to have a window would be amazing. So when I started telepractice, at the same time, we bought a new home. And I literally, as I walked through every home that we thought of buying, I was like, where am I putting my office? And literally my window, I'm in, I actually have lucky enough to have a walkout basement, but we have 9 giant windows in our walkout basement. And I am like, I just sit by the sun every single day, and I have never been more happy.
That's great. That's great. That's funny that you say that too, because I was just mentioning that my office is in the basement, and I do have a window, but there's like bushes out in front of it. So I today am upstairs recording in my daughter's room that has a nice bright window, because I'm the same way. I need my sunlight.
It makes us happy. And, those are things that, those little things. And if at the end of the post, I actually give advice to administrator, the next time that you get a speech therapist, I hope she's kind of treated a little bit better than I would be. And here's my advice to you, and you can read part of that if you'd like to, or for anyone who wants to read it, I kind of give advice about, if you're an administrator, these are little things that make us happy. We really aren't asking for the world. We're really just asking for a handful of really easy things that would make us happy. I don't think I've often heard it said before that, speech therapists are just real high maintenance. And I don't really consider us to be high maintenance. I really feel like we are a profession that have these giant hearts, and we want to be able to do it all. And we want to be able to we want people also to know our worth. We've gone to school for a really long time. These new girls have mountains of debt, and we just we want our worth to be known.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And it's so frustrating. Like you said, you were kind of joining together with other SLPs and you still weren't being heard. And I think it's one thing if you're being heard and there's maybe some empathy and saying, our hands are tied, there's certain things we can't do. But just to kind of be ignored when you're trying to be so proactive, that's a whole different level of frustrating.
Well, and even the fact that we were coming up with easy, cheap solutions to our own problems. We didn't just lay the problems at our desk and say, you need to fix all this. We literally developed in my case, we actually had a presentation of things that we would like to see, how we could retain people and just the small things that you could do to make this job better. And it just kind of fell on deaf ears. And again, I didn't necessarily write the post based on my own experience. What happened was I talked to girls of all ages, experience levels, and they resonated my same story. So I was like, well, here I'm not alone.
Right.
That's really the interesting part about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what were some of the other things? I know we touched on not having money for resources, not having a proper office, possibly caseload size. Oh, I know one thing that I wanted to bring up was speech teacher, being called speech teacher. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know there's a little bit of a divide. Some people, they kind of welcome it, and then other people are like, don't even.
I'll be honest with you. My own personal opinion is that was something that never bothered me,
Mm-hmm.
but I know it's something that bothers a lot of people. And so that was something I had to bring up in the post because, the speech teacher, is she a social teacher? Is he a psych teacher? That was the other thing about it is that, when I know why people feel that way. The level of education that we have puts us in such a dynamic place, in such a place that is so much different than our colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why that actually bothers people, and I should talk about that in the blog post about, our skills are so much different than a air quote teacher. Again, it doesn't personally bother me. And especially too, when I'd work with families don't know pathologist. They know speech teacher. And so I never, the years I did early intervention, the years that I see kids privately, they'll say, oh, you're speech teacher. That really doesn't bother me. But I do know for people, it's a pain point for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Now, I know you wrote another article about bullying in the SLP workplace. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. It's something that's a little bit difficult to talk about, but that was another post where, I woke up one day and I was like, today's the day. I have to, for lack of a better word, I have to vomit this onto paper. That's I have these creative waves, and that's kind of one of the things that happens to me when it comes to writing. I just have this urge to put it on paper. And I actually wrote it with the intention of never publishing it. But then once I wrote it, I was like, is there somebody that could benefit from my experience? And I'm a very religious, faithful person. And I really felt like God was telling me, somebody will benefit from this. So it needs to get on paper. So my experience was, and I didn't really go into the details specifically in the blog post, but essentially, I was in a situation where, special education as a whole is just changing. There's so much, public education, there's a lack of resources, and school districts are sometimes forced to make decisions maybe they wouldn't otherwise make had they had funds or resources. And so I was put in a situation where over and over and over again, I was seeing special education be last in line and students not getting what they needed to get. And I tried to go about it the right way. What can we do? I'm a problem solver. That's what I do. And I love to lead and I love to teach. And so, trying to go down the right avenues of this isn't right. What can we creatively do to fix these problems? And it really, in the situation I was in, it was very much of like a oligarchy. One person makes the decisions and we don't want to hear from the masses, and we don't really want to collaborate with you. It was a traditional, boss, authority figure sort of a situation. And so unfortunately, in their mind, I had sort of crossed a line where I had spoken out at a board meeting and I had asked the board for what we needed as a staff member, in a very professional way. This is what we see collectively. And I spoke for a group of people. It wasn't just myself. This is what we see as a special education department. This is what we would really need to make us feel really good about coming to work every day. And so we're asking you to consider those things. Well, unfortunately, the director of special ed was she felt very offended and very hurt that I spoke up. I will also preface this by saying, this is something that I think my readers should know. In this situation, I worked and lived in the same community. So I worked at my children's elementary school. So I was privy to seeing my students who were also my neighbors, who were also the same kids that played softball with my daughter or danced with my other daughter. And I'm knowing in the back of my mind that they're not getting what they need. So that puts me in a unique perspective because I care about my community and I care about my neighbor and I care about the little girl that my daughter dances with and I care about the girl who's trying to learn softball with my other daughter, and I care about these families. These are people that sometimes I hung out with at the pool and the park, and so it wasn't simply just a job for me. I was completely immersed in this community. So not only did I speak up at the board meeting as a staff member, but I spoke up as a community member as well. It did not go well. It was not received well, despite the professionalism that I had. And I essentially made the wrong people mad. And so very quickly, the job and the job that I knew and loved changed immediately. I began to be physically intimidated in my office by principals. I was often cornered when other people weren't around and things were said to me. I then was transferred from my children's school, probably as a retaliatory. They knew that junior high wasn't my thing, and I was very open about that. I really love littles. And so what did they do? They transferred me to the junior high with no reason whatsoever. And so I tried to fight that. I got more pushback. Then all of a sudden I was being written up for things that I didn't do. They were lying about things that they said that I did. And when I would try to essentially defend myself or come back with proof, they were like, well, we don't need proof. I'm like, yes, you do. And unfortunately, in a small town, the union, as good as they tried to be, the union president is best friends with the administrators, and this is a really small town, so everybody knows everybody's kids. They've lived together for generations. It's a farming community, so I didn't really get any help. And it became so significant that every day something was happening. I was afraid to go to work, and I started to have panic, and I started to have like this depression. And each day I got another blow from something else. I was accused of something. I was physically intimidated. I was told over and over again that I wasn't good enough. I was lucky enough that one of the board members happened to be a good friend of mine. And she was informing me of the lies that the administrators were telling about me in closed session, which made me even more anxious. The teachers and the community rallied against the board. The board received over 20 letters from parents who loved me, wanted to keep me, didn't know why I was being transferred. Many of them actually spoke out, and it didn't matter. It was, we're moving her. And the more I resisted, the worse the trauma became. So in the end, my husband had enough, and I live in Illinois. He called down to the headquarters of the union in Springfield, Illinois. And he said, my wife needs somebody to help her. And so a union representative from like the main headquarters here in our area came up, and she helped me. And we had meetings and meetings and meetings, and she fought on my behalf. And at one point she literally turned to me and she said, I'm going to tell you something. They hate you.
Wow.
They will go to any lengths to bring you down. Are you hearing me? You cannot stay here. I'm afraid of what can happen to your children. I am afraid of what can happen to you as a career. They will go to any lengths to ruin you. You take your name off the door, you take your good name, you take it with you, and you go. And when I heard that, I was like, I can't ignore that. As much as I want to stay here, and as much as I want to fight for the kids, and as much as I want to fight for my job, and I don't want to give in to what they're doing to me, I also realize that I'm going to land myself in a mental hospital if I stay. So the experience was extremely traumatic, and I left. I was lucky enough to land in a wonderful school district, and I made amazing friends, and they helped kind of build me back up. I still have a lot of like PTSD sort of symptoms. I still struggle, like even though we moved. So, and then a year later, we moved completely. So we moved out of the town, we moved 2 hours away. I started telepractice, but I still have weird things. If I even totally different person, totally different district, if I get an email, let's say from my daughter's principal, I literally can feel my neck begin to get hot and I begin to feel panic. Or like she has an event at school, I find it really hard to walk even into a physical school building. It's been that traumatic for me. So I wrote the blog post because I felt like it was just, I kept it really hidden for a long time, and I had a lot of shame over it because I still thought I did this to myself. I'm bad, I'm wrong. All the things they said about me are true. That I'm worthless, I'm not a good speech therapist, nobody likes me, and that I internalized all of that. So I still have some of that at some level, but I've learned to I'm almost there. I feel like I've almost regained some of that at this point, but it's very traumatic. I can't even really go into like a school building without feeling some anxiety. So it's really traumatic. So I wrote the blog post, and the response was, I can't believe this has happened to me. I can't believe this has happened to me. And so I just keep getting letter after letter after letter after email after email. And every time somebody reposts the post, I get at least 3 direct messages of, I read your story and this happened to me. And actually at one point, this was back in November, I got this very long email from a follower who detailed her experience and how my experience resonated with her and how my post really helped her. And I literally did this giant Facebook Live because I was like, I have to address this. I want people to know that I'm hearing you. I don't know the answer to this, except for if you feel like you're being violated in any way, get out. No one should have to live like that. But again, I go back to the deeper issue. What is systemic that this is happening? I mean, this isn't just education. This is healthcare. This is, law enforcement. This is not unique. We are not a unique culture. Education as itself is not the only field. We are not the only field that this is happening. So this person who wrote me happened to be a speech therapist, so it resonated with her. And I did a Facebook Live, and it literally has been my Facebook Live that has gotten the most attention because people keep watching it. I was like, I hear that this is affecting you. And I if I could give you any advice, it would just be like, you can't stay in that. It's no different than an abusive marriage. You can't stay in that relationship. So those 2 blog posts, really, the Dear Administrator and my bullying, still to this day are some of the most, they get the most hits. And I don't know that I'm proud of that. I mean, I feel at some level it speaks to something that's going on in education and in our world. So although I'm proud that I wrote them, I'm not proud that they get as much attention as they do, because it makes me sad.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely think they are both unique types of posts. They're very candid. You see a lot of posts out there about, spring themed resources, or, I mean, this is real stuff. And I mean, that's part of what really intrigued me and why I wanted to talk about this, is because it's something really personal, and obviously you're not the only person who has experienced these things. I mean, I'm kind of horrified that so many people are resonating with the bullying one. I mean, that just blows my mind a little bit, but I believe it. And you're right. It's not even just schools, different setting. I mean, this happens all the time. It's just not everyone's courageous enough to speak out about it or to share their story. So I commend you for doing that.
Well, one of the things I always say, and people who know me say, I really strive to be as authentic as I can. And even though through that pain, I do believe that God puts us in situations to learn. I learned a lot from that experience. But through that experience, if I can help one person, it's okay for me to share that. And, I read a quote, anyone who knows Brene Brown, if you love her work, she has a quote, and she said something about, owning your story and moving through that story and telling your story is one of the most bravest things you'll ever do. But yet it's one of the most powerful things that will heal you. And that's honestly what I've experienced. Being brave enough to own it, say this happened to me, and this is my experience, and sharing that with the rest of the world has not only healed me, but what power does it have to help somebody else know that they're not alone?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now let's kind of spin this a little bit to end on a positive note for today. What are some things, obviously leaving, if things are too bad, we know that leaving is the best thing, get out. But for those SLPs who want to try to make it work within the schools, maybe that's their setting and that's where they really feel that's where they're called to be. What are some things that they can do to avoid burnout?
Well, I definitely think that it's okay to give yourself permission to keep trying to find the right setting for yourself. Maybe the actual school that you're in has a poor culture, and just moving to another school within that same district maybe is the key for you. Maybe every school has its unique culture. And so maybe moving to a different culture, or trying, maybe you've been a pre-K therapist for a long time, maybe going up to junior high and seeing what that is like. That's the one thing telepractice has taught me. I've had this opportunity to work with so many different kids that I probably would have never had the opportunity to work with had I stayed where I was at. And so for me, that's been a really nice experience. I also think that giving yourself some boundaries. I was really lucky enough for my podcast, I interviewed Jessie Andrix, and she is someone who is really coaching and helping speech therapists avoid burnout through yoga, through meditation, through journaling, finding ways to draw boundaries for yourself so that you can be the best SLP that you possibly can. Again, you have to pay attention to your physical symptoms. I feel like if there are some speech therapists that can take on a caseload of 120 and they come to work every day and they're smiling and everything is just wonderful for them and they're engaged and that's what they love. But that's not everybody's personality. And that definitely is not my personality. I need to wake up every day, and I'm a little bit more of a rigid person, and I kind of have a way of how I like to do therapy. And so if you have a certain perspective on how you want your dream job to be, I do think that you should kind of follow that or try to carve that out for yourself. Again, it's going to depend on the setting and how flexible your district, your administrator, your supervisor is to kind of help you carve that out, which has been one of the things I've loved about telepractice. Is I feel like I finally have the autonomy to set that up for myself, which I didn't have in a school-based or even an early intervention setting. So those things, I think, yoga, making sure you're doing self-care. That's the other thing. We have so many wonderful SLPs right now that are our popular favorites who are shouting from the rooftops, take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. Make sure your health comes first. Make sure your family comes first. And, I'm seeing, this is one thing I noticed when I talk to speech therapists who have called me about telepractice. They go into it and they are full speed ahead, and they're spending till 5, 6 o'clock at night every day at work, and they're laminating and they're cutting and they're gluing and they're, new interesting projects every day. And they set this bar so high for themselves. And then 5 years later, they have a family and they're like, I can't do this anymore. And in a way, I think there's a sense of failure because you're not the SLP that you used to be. And I feel like we put so much pressure on ourselves when, we really, and I'm surely not advocating, to walk in and not plan and, just not be like you fly by the seat of your pants kind of speech therapist. But I'm saying that, recognize your limitations. there's only so much that you can do. There's only so much you can give. And, you know, my friend and I used to have this really funny saying. We used to be like, if you make it work on the $5 they give you, they'll never give you 25 that you need. So, you know, buying your own materials, you know, being a rock star on the $5 that they've given you, you know, 10 years down the road when you're feeling burned out because you don't have what you need, you've just proven to yourself you can make it work on that $5. They're not going to give you 25.
That's a good point.
So, I know, right? Because we're buying our own things and we're constantly like, nope, not asking for materials. I'll tell you right now, girls, if you're new grads, every year make a list of what you need and hand it to somebody. Because if you continue to make your own materials and buy your own stuff from the dollar spot and everything and be a rock star therapist, they will never, ever cave and buy you what you need because there's no windfall of money. Not in public education anyway. That's my tip. Make a list. Go through the catalogs and make your wish list every year.
That's true. That's true. And I mean, I would say also, just from my own experience, you know, you mentioned having a family and not being able to sustain, you know, if it's possible, consider changing your hours if you can, you know, going to part-time. You're not a failure if you have to do that. If that's what you need to do to take care of yourself and your family, then that's what you do.
Absolutely. And inherent in that, you know, so many of us are very type A and, you know, we have this dream for our life, you know, with the 3-bedroom, 2-bath house and the dog and the 2.5 kids and the, you know, we're always have our makeup on and our hair done and fancy clothes. And, you know, at some point something has to give. And so if it means you go to part-time and then you buy a duplex so that you can afford to do that, give yourself permission to do that. There's no shame in that. Really, you know, at 44 years old, I think so much differently now than I did in my 20s. And I think so differently about what brings me joy. And what brings me joy is truly all of those simple things. And, you know, I also had an experience that, you know, my husband was out of work for two years and I carried everything and it was a ton and my babies were little. And there were times where I didn't know, you know, I was down to my last diaper and I was like, I don't know where we're going to get money to buy new diapers. It's an experience that changed us. And so I recognize that it's okay to pare down a little bit so that you can be the best you that you can be the best mom, be the best daughter, be the best wife, whatever that means for you. You have to find a way to carve that out for yourself because so many of us are trying to be, we're trying to do it all and be it all the time. And it's such a bad place to be because you have to always feel like you're failing. There's no way we can all pull it off. We can't do the perfect birthday party and the, you know, the gourmet meal every night and, you know, perfectly styled hair and perfectly clean house. It's a fallacy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's true. Yeah. I like to, maybe each year, I don't know as often as each year, but I like to kind of make a list of like the top 3 things that are the most important to me. And then I think, you know, if everything else doesn't align with that, then how can I change it? You know, I want to focus on what's important and really keep the big picture in mind because it's easy to get bogged down with all the details and responsibilities. So, you know, you can always kind of circle back and look at that list of those 3 things. And if it doesn't fit the bill, then make a change.
Yeah. And I find that complaining is sort of an epidemic. People love to complain about how busy they are. And I always feel sad when people say that. Oh, I'm just so busy. I, you know, didn't have a chance to watch any TV this week or, you know, I don't have time for this or I don't have time for that. And it's like, that really is a choice. It really is a choice. And complaining about the time that you don't have, well, you signed your kids up for something every single night. Isn't that you?
That's exactly what I was, that's just what I was thinking.
That's about you.
I was thinking about overscheduling whenever you said that. And I was like, yeah, that's a thing.
Well, and for anyone listening to this podcast, I'll plug a book really quick. I read Emily Lay's books this summer about grace, not perfection. And then she has a simplified kind of a guide to simplified life. And I'm here to tell you that at 44 years old, if somebody would have handed me that book at 25, it would have absolutely been a gold mine because I've spent so much time trying to create this idea of what in my head was perfection, when all I really needed was to give myself a little bit of grace. And so through God provided those experiences for me, because he knocked me down quite a bit with the experiences that I've had. And so he's humbled me in so much of a way that I'm so appreciative. But if somebody would have handed me that book, I know that as a new mom, I would have been very different. So I feel like if anyone's listening to this who's on the verge of having their first baby, or maybe their second baby, that's a really good read for you.
Great. I'll make sure that I link to that in the show notes. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about? I know you have a Teachers Pay Teachers store and a website.
Yes, I do. Actually, my focus is I create, very similar to you, I create no print, no prep products specifically for teletherapy platforms and iPads and smart boards. And I did that basically as a response to, I started teletherapy and there's really nothing. Kids got sick really quick of my black and white PDF printables. And so I just decided that I was like, I need something more to engage these kiddos. So I started to create, and that's where I am now. I'm creating things for other teletherapists and people who maybe really love that iPad but want to control their content a little bit more, rather than an app. So huge fan of that, huge fan of Boom Cards as well. And then I have a website where I blog about all kinds of things related to telepractice, as well as some other topics like career change and things like that. And then I also, like you, started a podcast for telepractice. So a lot of my guests have something to do with telepractice or related to career change or career challenges. So you can go to my website at www.whimsicalword.com and you can find all the wonderful things that are there for you to browse if you'd like.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I'll make sure that I link to all that in the show notes as well.
Perfect.
All right, Andee. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I feel like we touched on so much great information today. So I really appreciate you sharing.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad we finally got a chance to meet and we were able to talk about some of those, difficult concepts to rumble with, but I'm glad that I was able to kind of come on and talk about that as well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Definitely. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. As always, if you like what you heard, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on iTunes to help your fellow SLPs find the show. To access the show notes from today's episode, go to bit.ly/TSSEP47. Again, that's bit.ly/TSSEP47. If you'd like to learn how you can cut back on your prep time this year, head on over to thespeechspace.com/digital SLP. And if you'd like to receive text alerts when the digital SLP doors open back up, you can text DSLP WAIT to 555-888. All right, my friends, that is it for me for today. I thank you for tuning in and hope that you have a wonderful week.